The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., cutting through the darkness of Victoria's tiny apartment. She rolled over and hit the snooze button, but her body was already awake. After 15 years of the same routine, she didn't really need the alarm anymore. Her internal clock had adjusted to this early schedule long ago. Victoria sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back. The cheap mattress had seen better days, but replacing it wasn't in her budget right now. She shuffled to the small kitchenette and put on a pot of coffee. While it brewed, she looked out her window at the city that was still sleeping. Streetlights flickered against the pre-dawn darkness, and only a few early commuters hurried along the sidewalks below. Her apartment was small but clean. Everything had its place and nothing was wasted. A single bookshelf held her few possessions, some paperback novels, a framed photo of her mother, and tucked in the corner, a small stack of sheet music that she never touched anymore. The pages were yellowed with age, and dust had settled on top of them like a blanket covering old memories. Victoria poured herself coffee into a chipped mug and sat at her small table. She had exactly 30 minutes before she needed to leave for work. This was her quiet time, the only part of the day that truly belonged to her. She sipped her coffee and watched the world wake up outside her window. At 5:15 a.m., she gathered her things. Her work uniform was simple: dark pants, a plain shirt, and comfortable shoes that could handle hours of walking on hard floors. She grabbed her bus pass and headed out into the cool morning air. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes. Victoria always sat in the same seat if it was available, third row on the right side. She liked watching the city transform as they moved from her working-class neighborhood to the wealthy cultural district. The buildings got taller and cleaner. The people waiting at bus stops were dressed better. Everything seemed to shine a little brighter. The Steinman Concert Hall stood like a palace among the other buildings. Its grand entrance was framed by marble columns, and large posters advertised upcoming performances by world-famous musicians. Victoria had walked past these posters thousands of times, but she never really looked at them anymore. They belonged to a world that wasn't hers. She entered through the employee entrance in the back. The security guard, old Pete, was already at his desk with his coffee and newspaper. "Morning, Vicky," he said without looking up. "Morning, Pete. How's the arthritis today?" "Same as always. Getting old ain't for the weak." He smiled and buzzed her through the security door. Victoria made her way to the maintenance room where she kept her cleaning supplies. The building was completely silent at this hour. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she gathered what she needed for the day. Cart loaded with supplies, she began her routine. She always started with the administrative offices on the third floor. These were easy. Just empty trash cans, dust the desks, and vacuum the carpets. The executives who worked here wouldn't arrive for another 4 hours. Their offices were filled with expensive furniture and awards from the music industry. Photos of them shaking hands with famous conductors and performers lined the walls. By 7 a.m., Victoria had moved down to the second floor where the music rooms were located. These smaller practice spaces were used by students and younger musicians. She could tell a lot about the people who used these rooms just by cleaning them. Some left their spaces neat and organized. Others scattered sheet music everywhere and left coffee cups on the pianos. In one room, she found a note scribbled on a piece of paper. "Mom, I'm trying so hard, but I don't think I'm good enough for this place." Victoria folded the note and threw it away, but the words stayed with her. She remembered feeling that same doubt once a long time ago. The hardest part of her job was the main concert hall itself. It was a beautiful space that could seat over 2,000 people. Red velvet seats faced a stage where the greatest musicians in the world had performed. The acoustics were perfect. Even a whisper from the stage could be heard in the back row. Victoria worked methodically through the aisles, checking each seat for programs or trash left behind from the previous night's performance. She dusted the ornate railings and cleaned the mirrors in the lobby. Every surface had to be perfect because wealthy patrons would arrive that evening for another show. Around 9 a.m., the building started coming alive. Musicians began arriving for morning rehearsals. Victoria had learned to be invisible during these times. She moved quietly through the halls, stepping aside when groups of performers walked past deep in conversation about their art. She overheard fragments of their discussions, complaints about conductors, excitement about upcoming tours, gossip about other musicians. They talked about places Victoria had never been and people she'd only seen in magazines. Their world was full of possibility and creativity, while hers was measured in square feet cleaned and trash cans emptied. But Victoria didn't feel sorry for herself. She had chosen this life, or maybe it had chosen her. Either way, it was honest work and it paid her bills. She took pride in doing her job well, even if nobody really noticed her efforts. The morning hours passed quickly. By 11 a.m., rehearsals were in full swing. Victoria could hear music drifting through the building as she worked. Sometimes it was a full orchestra practicing a symphony. Other times it was a single pianist working through a difficult passage over and over until they got it right. The sound of piano music always made her pause, though she tried not to let it show. There was something about those melodies that stirred memories she kept buried deep inside. Her fingers would unconsciously move as if they were finding the keys, muscle memory that never completely faded. During her lunch break, Victoria sat in the employee break room with a sandwich she'd brought from home. A few other maintenance workers joined her, and they talked about ordinary things: weekend plans, family news, television shows. It was comfortable conversation that didn't demand anything from her. After lunch, she tackled the basement storage areas. These rooms were filled with old equipment, extra chairs, and forgotten props from past productions. It was dusty work, but Victoria didn't mind. Down here, she was completely alone with her thoughts. In one storage room, she discovered an old piano pushed against the back wall. It was covered with a tarp and surrounded by stacks of music stands. The piano looked like it hadn't been played in years. Its wooden surface was dusty and some of the keys were yellowed with age. Victoria found herself drawn to it. She lifted the edge of the tarp and saw that it was a decent instrument, probably moved down here to make room for newer equipment upstairs. Without thinking, she touched one of the keys. It was out of tune, but it still made a sound. She quickly pulled her hand away and covered the piano back up. This wasn't her place, and these weren't her instruments to touch. She was here to clean, nothing more. By 4 p.m., Victoria's shift was ending. She returned her supplies to the maintenance room and clocked out. The building was now full of activity as evening preparations began. She slipped out the employee entrance, invisible once again to the world of music and performance happening inside. On the bus ride home, Victoria watched the city change back from elegant to ordinary. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: early alarm, coffee, bus ride, cleaning. It was a simple life, predictable and safe. She had made peace with it long ago, or so she told herself. Back in her apartment, Victoria heated up leftover soup for dinner. As she ate, she could swear she still heard piano music in her head, melodies that wouldn't leave her alone. She tried to push them away, but they lingered like ghosts from another lifetime. 3 weeks later, Victoria's routine was disrupted in a way she never expected. She had finished her regular cleaning duties and was preparing to leave when she noticed something unusual. The main concert hall's stage lights were still on, casting a warm glow across the empty auditorium. More importantly, the concert grand piano sat uncovered in the center of the stage. This was strange. The expensive Steinway was always covered with a protective cloth after performances and rehearsals. Someone must have forgotten, and Victoria knew that dust and temperature changes could damage such a valuable instrument. She had heard the musicians talk about how sensitive these pianos were, how they needed constant care and attention. Victoria looked around the empty hall. Everyone had gone home hours ago. The evening's performance had ended, and the audience had long since filed out into the night. Even Pete, the security guard, was probably doing his rounds on the other side of the building. She was completely alone. She should just cover the piano and leave. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But something drew her toward the stage. Maybe it was the way the lights created a golden circle around the instrument, or maybe it was the silence that seemed to be waiting for something to fill it. Victoria climbed the steps to the stage, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Up close, the piano was even more magnificent than it looked from the audience seats. Its black surface reflected the stage lights like a mirror, and the keys seemed to glow with an inner light. She had never been this close to such a beautiful instrument. She reached out to touch the fallboard, just to feel the smooth wood under her fingers. But as her hand made contact with the piano, something unexpected happened. Her fingers seemed to move on their own, lifting the fallboard to reveal the pristine keys beneath. The piano bench was still positioned perfectly in front of the instrument. Victoria knew she shouldn't sit down. She knew she shouldn't even be on this stage. But the pull was too strong to resist. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just to see what it felt like to sit at such a magnificent piano. The bench was exactly the right height. Victoria placed her feet on the pedals and let her hands hover over the keys. She could feel the weight of the action, the perfect balance of the instrument. This was so different from the old, beaten-up piano in the basement storage room that she had discovered weeks ago. Without really deciding to do it, Victoria let her right hand fall gently onto the keys. She played a simple C major scale, and the sound that came out was pure magic. Each note was clear and perfect, ringing through the concert hall with crystalline beauty. The acoustics of the hall made even this simple exercise sound like music from heaven. Her left hand joined in, and suddenly she was playing a piece she hadn't touched in 20 years. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had learned as a teenager. Her fingers remembered every note, every delicate phrase, every subtle change in dynamics. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of cleaning supplies and forgotten dreams. As she played, Victoria felt something awakening inside her that had been sleeping for so long, she had almost forgotten it existed. The music flowed through her fingers like water, natural and effortless. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the technique anymore. She was just feeling the music, letting it carry her away from the world of mop buckets and vacuum cleaners. The nocturne built to its climax, and Victoria found herself putting everything she had felt over the past 20 years into those notes. All the longing, all the sadness, all the dreams she had given up. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, singing with a voice that seemed to come from her very soul. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway outside. She didn't notice the door to the concert hall opening quietly. She was completely absorbed in the piece, playing with an intensity and passion that surprised even her. Sebastian Ashworth had returned to the concert hall to retrieve his sheet music, which he had accidentally left on a music stand backstage. He was annoyed at having to come back so late, especially since he had an important meeting with his agent the next morning. As one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation, Sebastian's time was valuable, and he didn't like having it wasted on such mundane tasks. He was walking briskly toward the stage door when he heard the music. Sebastian stopped in his tracks, immediately recognizing the Chopin Nocturne. But who could be playing at this hour? The hall was supposed to be empty, and he knew all the pianists who had access to the building after hours. The playing was exquisite. Whoever was at the piano had real talent, real understanding of the music. Sebastian found himself drawn toward the sound, curious to see which of his colleagues was practicing so late. Perhaps it was one of the younger concert artists, working on repertoire for an upcoming performance. He pushed open the door to the main auditorium and stepped inside. The sight that greeted him was not at all what he expected. Instead of a fellow musician in concert attire, he saw a woman in a plain work uniform sitting at his piano. She was completely absorbed in her playing, her eyes closed, swaying slightly with the music. Sebastian's first emotion was confusion. He didn't recognize this woman, and she certainly wasn't dressed like any musician he knew. His confusion quickly turned to recognition as he realized who she was. He had seen her before, emptying trash cans and mopping floors. She was the cleaning lady, one of the invisible people who worked behind the scenes to keep the concert hall running. But how could the cleaning lady play like this? The music she was producing was not amateur playing. This was sophisticated, professional-level performance. Sebastian stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he was hearing. As the nocturne came to its gentle conclusion, Victoria opened her eyes and seemed to realize where she was. The spell was broken and reality came crashing back. She was sitting at a piano worth more than she made in 5 years, in a concert hall where she had no business being on stage. She quickly pulled her hands away from the keys and started to stand up. But that's when she noticed Sebastian standing in the doorway. Her heart began to race as she recognized him. Everyone who worked in the building knew Sebastian Ashworth. He was famous, important, and definitely not someone who would understand why the janitor was playing his piano. "I'm sorry," Victoria said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just covering the piano and She trailed off, unable to come up with a reasonable explanation for what he had just witnessed. Sebastian walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage, his eyes never leaving Victoria. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between shock and suspicion. When he reached the front row, he stopped and looked up at her. That was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet hall. Victoria nodded, still standing by the piano bench, ready to flee at any moment. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Sebastian asked, and there was something in his tone that Victoria couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't friendly either. Victoria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had been caught red-handed, and now she would probably lose her job. "I took some lessons when I was younger," she said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of her musical background. Sebastian climbed the steps to the stage, moving closer to Victoria and the piano. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had thought, probably in his early 30s. His expensive suit and perfectly styled hair marked him as someone from a completely different world than hers. "Some lessons," he repeated, and now Victoria could definitely hear skepticism in his voice. "That didn't sound like some lessons to me." Victoria stood frozen beside the piano bench, her heart pounding so loud she was sure Sebastian could hear it. She had never felt so exposed, so out of place. This was his world, his stage, his piano. She was just the woman who cleaned up after everyone went home. "I really should go," Victoria said, taking a step toward the stage stairs. "I didn't mean to disturb anything. I was just—" "Wait," Sebastian said, holding up his hand. He walked closer to the piano, running his fingers along its polished surface. "This is a very expensive instrument. Do you understand that?" Victoria nodded, feeling smaller by the second. "Yes, sir, I know. I shouldn't have touched it." Sebastian's eyes narrowed as he studied her. "You said you took some lessons when you were younger. What kind of lessons? Piano lessons at a community center? Some old lady teaching you chopsticks in her living room?" There was something in his tone that made Victoria's chest tighten. It wasn't just curiosity. It was mockery, barely disguised behind polite words. She recognized that tone from her childhood, from people who looked at her family's small apartment and second-hand clothes and made assumptions about what she was capable of. "I had proper lessons," Victoria said quietly, but with a hint of steel in her voice that surprised them both. Sebastian laughed, and the sound echoed through the empty concert hall. "Proper lessons, really? Because what I just heard—" He paused, shaking his head. "Look, I don't know how you managed to memorize that piece, but playing one nocturne doesn't make you a pianist." Victoria felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I never said it did." "Good, because this world—" Sebastian gestured around the concert hall. "This isn't a place for hobbyists or people who learn to play from YouTube videos. This is serious music, performed by serious musicians who have dedicated their entire lives to their craft." "I understand that," Victoria said. But Sebastian wasn't finished. "Do you? Because what I see is someone who works as a janitor thinking she can just sit down at a concert grand piano and play like she belongs here." His voice was getting louder now, more condescending. "This instrument costs more than most people make in a year. The musicians who play on this stage have studied at the finest conservatories in the world." Victoria felt something stirring inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. It was anger, but also something else. Pride, maybe, or just exhaustion at being dismissed so easily. "And what makes you think I haven't?" she asked. Sebastian blinked, caught off guard by her question. "Haven't what?" "Studied at a conservatory. Dedicated my life to music. What makes you so sure that this uniform tells you everything about who I am?" For a moment, Sebastian looked uncertain, but then his arrogant smile returned. "Because if you had real training, real talent, you wouldn't be here mopping floors. You'd be performing, making recordings, building a career. The music world doesn't overlook genuine talent." Victoria almost laughed at that. The music world overlooked genuine talent all the time, especially when that talent came wrapped in the wrong package or from the wrong background. But she didn't say that. Instead, she said, "Maybe some of us had other priorities." "Other priorities?" Sebastian shook his head dismissively. "If you really had the gift, nothing would have stopped you from pursuing it. Real musicians sacrifice everything for their art. They don't give up and become cleaning ladies." That was the moment something snapped inside Victoria. She had spent 20 years telling herself that her sacrifices were noble, that taking care of her mother was more important than her dreams. She had convinced herself that she was at peace with her choices. But hearing this privileged young man dismiss her struggles so casually awakened something fierce inside her. "You know what?" Victoria said, turning to face him fully. "You're right about one thing. Real musicians don't give up easily. And maybe it's time I proved that I'm a real musician." Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Victoria said, surprised by her own boldness, "that if you think one nocturne doesn't prove anything, maybe we should test that theory." "Test it how?" Victoria looked at the piano, then back at Sebastian. "You seem very confident in your abilities. Very sure that training and background are what matter most in music. So let's see. You and me, right here, right now. We both play and let the music speak for itself." Sebastian stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. It was a rich, full laugh that filled the concert hall. "You're challenging me? To what exactly?" "A musical duel," Victoria said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "We each play a piece of our choosing. Let the music decide who really understands what it means to be a musician." Sebastian's laughter died away, but his amused smile remained. "This is ridiculous. You do realize who I am, don't you? I've performed with the New York Philharmonic. I've played at Carnegie Hall. My last recording won a Grammy nomination." "I know exactly who you are," Victoria said. "The question is, do you know who you are when all those credentials are stripped away? When it's just you and the music?" Something flickered in Sebastian's eyes. Was it annoyance? Or maybe just a tiny hint of uncertainty? "This is absurd. I have nothing to prove to—" He gestured vaguely at her uniform. "To the cleaning lady?" Victoria finished for him. "You're right. You have nothing to prove. You're clearly the superior musician. So what are you afraid of?" Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of anything." "Then play," Victoria said simply. They stood facing each other on the stage, the piano between them like a challenge waiting to be accepted. The concert hall stretched out before them, 2,000 empty seats bearing witness to this unlikely confrontation. Sebastian looked around the hall, then back at Victoria. "Fine," he said finally. "But when this is over, when I've demonstrated the difference between real training and whatever it is you think you can do, I want you to understand something. This world isn't a democracy. Talent isn't enough. You need proper education, proper connections, proper breeding. Music isn't just about playing notes. It's about understanding culture, history, the social context that gives meaning to art." Victoria nodded slowly. "I understand exactly what you're saying, and I disagree with every word of it." "We'll see about that," Sebastian said. He was already reaching for his phone. "But if we're going to do this properly, we need witnesses. Real musicians who can judge fairly. Witnesses?" Victoria felt her confidence wavering slightly. "Of course. What's the point of proving my superiority if no one's here to see it?" Sebastian's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen. "I'm texting some colleagues. A few advanced students. Maybe some music critics who might find this educational." Victoria watched him sending messages, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. Playing alone in an empty concert hall was one thing. Playing in front of Sebastian's friends and colleagues was something else entirely. "Having second thoughts?" Sebastian asked, noticing her hesitation. Victoria straightened her shoulders. "No, not at all." "Good. Because once word gets out about this little competition, there's no backing down. The classical music community is smaller than you might think. Everyone will know about the janitor who thought she could challenge Sebastian Ashworth." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. But it was too late to back down now. She had made her choice, and she would see it through to the end. "When?" she asked. Sebastian smiled, and there was something predatory in his expression. "Tomorrow night. After the evening performance. That gives me time to gather a proper audience for your education." Victoria nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "Tomorrow night, then." As Sebastian walked away, his phone already ringing as he called his first contact, Victoria remained alone on the stage with the piano. What had she done? Victoria barely slept that night. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had lost her mind. What had possessed her to challenge Sebastian Ashworth of all people? By morning, her confidence from the night before felt like a distant dream, replaced by cold reality and mounting panic. She went through her usual morning routine like a robot. Coffee, shower, work clothes, bus ride. but everything felt different now. The other passengers on the bus seemed to be looking at her strangely, though she knew that was just her imagination running wild. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone somehow knew about her foolish challenge. When she arrived at the concert hall, Pete the security guard greeted her with his usual nod, but even that felt different. Did he know? Had Sebastian already told people? Victoria's hands shook slightly as she gathered her cleaning supplies, and she had to force herself to focus on simple tasks. The morning passed in a blur of nervous energy. Every time she heard footsteps in the hallway, Victoria's heart jumped. Every conversation she overheard between musicians made her wonder if they were talking about her. She kept her head down and tried to work normally, but concentration was nearly impossible. Around 10 o'clock, she was cleaning one of the practice rooms when she heard voices in the hallway. Two young musicians were talking excitedly as they walked past. "Did you hear about Sebastian's challenge?" one of them said. "You mean the thing with the cleaning lady?" "I thought that was just a joke." "No, it's real. He's been texting everyone. Says he's going to teach someone a lesson about knowing your place. This I have to see. When is it happening?" "Tonight, after the evening concert." "He's making it a whole event." Victoria's stomach dropped. A whole event? She had pictured maybe a few people watching, not some kind of spectacle. She pressed herself against the wall of the practice room, hoping they wouldn't notice her as they continued down the hall. "I heard he's inviting music critics too," the second voice said, fading as they moved away. "Someone said there might even be people from the conservatory coming." Victoria sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Music critics? People from the conservatory? This was spiraling completely out of control. She had challenged Sebastian in a moment of anger and wounded pride, but she hadn't thought about what would happen when the story spread through the tight-knit classical music community. The rest of the morning was torture. Victoria tried to focus on her work, but every time she saw a group of musicians talking, she was convinced they were discussing her. Some of them glanced in her direction, and she couldn't tell if she was imagining the smirks and whispers or if they were really there. During her lunch break, Victoria sat alone in the employee break room, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for. Her co-worker Janet came in, grabbed her lunch from the refrigerator, and sat down across from her. "You look terrible," Janet said bluntly. "Are you getting sick?" Victoria almost laughed. "Sick with terror, maybe. I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well." Janet studied her with knowing eyes. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the rumors going around upstairs, would it?" Victoria's heart stopped. "What rumors?" "Come on, Vicky. The whole building is buzzing about some piano competition tonight, and your name keeps coming up." Victoria put her head in her hands. "Oh God, what are they saying?" "Depends who you ask," Janet said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Some people think it's hilarious. Rich boy pianist versus the janitor. Others think it's mean-spirited, like watching a car wreck happen in slow motion. And what do you think?" Victoria asked quietly. Janet was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "I think there's more to you than most people around here realize. I've seen you when you think nobody's looking. Sometimes when there's music playing in the halls, you get this expression on your face, like you're somewhere else entirely." Victoria looked up. "Surprised, I also think," Janet continued, "that Sebastian Ashworth is an arrogant little prince who's never had anyone challenge him in his entire privileged life. Maybe it's time someone did. But what if I embarrass myself? What if I prove that he's right about everything?" Janet shrugged. "Then you embarrass yourself, so what? At least you'll know you tried. Most people spend their whole lives wondering what if and never find out." After lunch, Victoria couldn't concentrate on anything. She found herself making excuses to walk past the main concert hall, drawn like a magnet to the stage where everything would unfold in just a few hours. Each time she looked at that piano, her emotions swung wildly between terror and determination. By afternoon, the building was electric with anticipation. Victoria overheard fragments of conversations everywhere she went. Apparently, Sebastian had been making phone calls all day, personally inviting people to witness what he called an educational demonstration. The way people talked about it, he was treating the whole thing like a masterclass in knowing your place in the world. Around 3 o'clock, Victoria was organizing supplies in a storage closet when she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Sebastian's voice carried clearly as he talked to someone on his phone. "Trust me, this will be worth watching," he was saying. I'm going to demonstrate the difference between real artistry and amateur enthusiasm. It'll be a good reminder for everyone about why we have standards in this business." Victoria heard laughter from whoever was on the other end of the call. "Oh, she thinks she's a real musician," Sebastian continued. "You should have seen her last night sitting at the Steinway like she owned the place. I'm going to enjoy bringing her back down to reality." More laughter. Then Sebastian's voice grew fainter as he walked away. "See you tonight. This is going to be fun." Victoria stood in the dark storage closet surrounded by mops and cleaning supplies and felt something change inside her. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something stronger. Anger, yes, but also a deep, burning need to prove that Sebastian's assumptions about her were wrong. She thought about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to pay for Victoria's piano lessons when she was young. Her mother had believed in her talent even when they could barely afford food. She thought about all the hours she had practiced, all the dreams she had sacrificed, all the music that still lived inside her despite 20 years of silence. Maybe Sebastian was right about one thing. Maybe the music world didn't overlook genuine talent. Maybe it was time to stop overlooking herself. Victoria left the storage closet and walked straight to the basement where she had discovered the old out-of-tune piano weeks ago. She pulled off the tarp and sat down at the bench. The keys were still yellowed and some stuck when she pressed them, but it would have to do. For the next 3 hours, Victoria played. She started with scales and exercises, warming up fingers that hadn't done serious practice in decades. Then she moved on to pieces she remembered, testing her memory and her technique. Some passages came back easily, as if she had played them yesterday. Others required work, careful attention to rebuild the muscle memory. She played Bach to strengthen her fingers and sharpen her precision. She played Mozart to remind herself about grace and clarity. She played Chopin to reconnect with the emotional depth that had always been her greatest strength as a young musician. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria felt something awakening that had been dormant for far too long. Not just her technical skills, though those were returning faster than she had hoped. It was her musical soul, the part of her that understood music not as a series of notes to be executed correctly, but as a language for expressing everything that words couldn't capture. By the time she finally stopped playing, the building had grown quiet. The evening performance upstairs would be starting soon, and after that, Victoria tried not to think about what came after that. She covered the old piano and made her way upstairs. In a few hours, she would find out if 20 years away from music had killed her talent, or if it had just been waiting patiently for her to remember who she really was. The evening concert was ending upstairs when Victoria finally gathered the courage to leave the basement. She could hear the distant sound of applause filtering through the building's floors, followed by the familiar noise of an audience filing out. Her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy, but there was no turning back now. She made her way to the employee restroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Her work uniform was wrinkled from hours of practicing, and her hair had come loose from its ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a janitor who had spent the day cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. But her eyes held something different now, something that hadn't been there in years. Victoria tried to fix her appearance as best she could, knowing it wouldn't matter much. She wasn't dressed for a performance, and she certainly didn't look like she belonged on the same stage as Sebastian Ashworth. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to prove that music didn't care what you wore or where you came from. As she walked toward the main concert hall, Victoria could already hear voices inside. Through the partially open doors, she caught glimpses of people filing in. Sebastian had been busy. There were at least 50 people already seated, and more were arriving every minute. She recognized some faces from around the building: musicians, music teachers, and advanced students from the conservatory. But there were others she didn't know, older people in expensive clothes who carried themselves with the confidence of music industry professionals. Her stomach churned as she realized these might be the critics and directors Sebastian had mentioned. Victoria stood outside the door, paralyzed by the sight of so many people. This wasn't what she had imagined when she made her challenge. She had pictured maybe a dozen observers, not a full audience, treating this like some kind of entertainment. Having second thoughts, Victoria spun around to find Sebastian behind her, looking perfectly composed in his expensive concert attire. He had changed from his casual clothes into formal performance wear: black tuxedo, perfectly styled hair, the kind of polished appearance that screamed professional musician. I was just... Victoria started, then stopped herself. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her doubt. I was waiting for you. Sebastian smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Good, because we have quite an audience tonight. I hope you're prepared for what's about to happen. Through the doors, Victoria could see people taking their seats, chatting excitedly among themselves. She caught fragments of conversation as people passed. This should be interesting. I can't believe Sebastian is actually going through with this. Poor woman has no idea what she's gotten herself into. It's almost cruel. Really, Victoria felt her confidence wavering again. But then she remembered something her mother used to tell her when she was young and nervous before recitals. Music doesn't know if you're rich or poor, honey. It only knows if you're honest with it. By the way, Sebastian said, straightening his bow tie, I should probably tell you who's in the audience tonight. There are several music critics from major publications, the director of the conservatory, and a few recording industry executives. I thought it would be educational for them to see the difference between trained artistry and, well, whatever it is you think you can do. Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The weight of what was happening was crushing down on her. These weren't just casual observers. These were people whose opinions could make or break careers in the classical music world. Oh, and I should mention, Sebastian continued, clearly enjoying her discomfort, I've invited a few local news reporters as well. This story is too good not to share. Janitor challenges world-class pianist. It practically writes itself. Victoria's heart sank even further. News reporters? This was turning into a circus, and she was about to be the main act in her own humiliation. Sebastian checked his watch. Well, I suppose we should begin. The sooner we start, the sooner this whole misunderstanding can be cleared up. He pushed open the doors to the concert hall, and Victoria followed him inside. The murmur of conversation died down as people noticed their entrance. All eyes turned toward them, and Victoria felt exposed under the bright stage lights that had been turned on for the occasion. The concert hall looked different with people in it. What had seemed elegant and peaceful when empty now felt intimidating and hostile. Every seat in the first several rows was filled, and people were still filing in. Word had clearly spread far beyond Sebastian's original contacts. As they walked down the aisle toward the stage, Victoria could feel the weight of every stare. She heard whispered comments that weren't quite quiet enough. That's her. She doesn't look like much. What is she thinking, challenging Sebastian Ashworth? This is going to be painful to watch. Someone should have talked her out of this. Victoria kept her eyes focused straight ahead, trying to block out the voices. But each comment felt like a small dagger, chipping away at what little confidence she had managed to build during her afternoon practice session. Sebastian, meanwhile, was clearly in his element. He nodded and smiled at people he recognized, stopping occasionally to shake hands with important-looking individuals. He was playing the role of the gracious professional, about to educate an unfortunate amateur. When they reached the front of the hall, Sebastian turned to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. What you're about to witness is, I hope, an educational demonstration about the nature of true musical artistry. The audience settled into their seats, expectant and eager for the show to begin. Music, Sebastian continued, is not a democratic art form. It requires years of dedicated study, proper training, and yes, a certain level of cultural understanding that cannot be faked or improvised. Tonight I hope to illustrate the difference between genuine artistry and well-meaning amateurism. Victoria felt heat rising in her cheeks. He was already setting up the narrative, painting her as a deluded amateur before she had even played a single note. Sebastian gestured toward her with a patronizing smile. My opponent tonight is Victoria, who works here as a custodial staff member. She believes that her limited musical background qualifies her to compete with professionally trained musicians. While I admire her enthusiasm, I think it's important that we all understand the reality of what separates trained artists from hobbyists, the audience murmured appreciatively. Sebastian was giving them exactly what they had come to see, a lesson in knowing one's place in the world. Now, Sebastian said, turning toward the stage, shall we begin this demonstration? As they climbed the steps to the stage, Victoria felt like she was walking to her own execution. The concert grand piano sat in the center of the stage under bright lights, looking both beautiful and terrifying. This was it. In just a few minutes, she would either validate everything Sebastian had said about her, or she would prove that 20 years away from music hadn't killed the musician inside her. The audience fell silent as they took their positions on stage. Victoria looked out at the sea of faces, all watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to barely concealed amusement. These people had come expecting to see her fail, to watch Sebastian put an uppity janitor in her place. Sebastian walked to the piano and ran his hand along its surface possessively. "Since this was your challenge," he said to Victoria, loud enough for the audience to hear, "I'll let you decide who goes first. Would you like to embarrass yourself immediately, or would you prefer to watch a real performance before you attempt your own?" Victoria looked at him, then at the piano, then out at the audience. Every instinct told her to run, to apologize and slink away before she made things worse. But somewhere deep inside, she heard an echo of the music she had played that afternoon, and her mother's voice reminding her that music only cared about honesty. "I'll go first," Victoria said quietly. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her choice. "Are you sure? Once you play, there's no taking it back." Victoria nodded, walking toward the piano bench. "I'm sure." As she sat down and adjusted the bench, Victoria could feel the weight of every eye in the audience. The silence was deafening. This was her moment of truth. Victoria sat at the piano bench, her hands resting on her lap as she stared at the keys. The silence in the concert hall was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. 50 pairs of eyes watched her every movement, waiting for her to begin what many of them assumed would be a spectacular failure. She could feel Sebastian standing behind her, probably enjoying every moment of her obvious nervousness. The audience shifted restlessly in their seats, and she caught a few whispered comments that weren't meant to be kind. "Poor thing looks terrified. This is going to be over quickly." "I almost feel bad for her." Victoria closed her eyes and tried to block out everything, except the piano in front of her. She thought about the afternoon she had spent practicing in the basement, how the music had slowly come back to her like a half-remembered dream becoming real again. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much to give her daughter a chance at something beautiful. When she opened her eyes, Victoria's hands moved to the keys. She had decided what to play during her practice session, though she hadn't been sure she would have the courage to go through with it. It was a piece that meant everything to her, one that told the story of her life in a way that words never could. She began with the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It started softly, almost like a whisper, with a simple melody that seemed to ask a question. The first few measures were deceptively gentle, and Victoria could sense the audience relaxing slightly, perhaps thinking this wouldn't be as embarrassing as they had expected. But as Victoria continued to play, something magical began to happen. The music started to come alive under her fingers, and with it, 20 years of buried emotions began to surface. This wasn't just a woman playing notes on a piano. This was someone telling her story through music, pouring her heart and soul into every phrase. The melody grew more complex, and Victoria's technique became more apparent. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of serious training. The audience began to sit up straighter in their seats, paying closer attention. This wasn't what they had expected at all. Victoria lost herself in the music, the way she used to when she was young, and the piano was her whole world. She wasn't thinking about technique or finger placement anymore. She was just feeling the music flow through her, letting it carry all the sadness and longing and hope that she had kept buried for so long. The ballade built to its first climax, and Victoria's playing became more passionate, more intense. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly as she navigated the complex passages. The piano sang under her touch, producing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just the strings and hammers inside the instrument. In the audience, people began to look at each other with expressions of confusion and surprise. This wasn't supposed to be happening. The janitor wasn't supposed to play like this, but there was no denying what they were hearing. Sebastian, standing at the side of the stage, felt his confident smile begin to fade. He had expected Victoria to stumble through a simple piece, maybe a basic melody that would prove his point about the difference between real musicians and amateurs. Instead, he was watching someone play with a level of musicianship that he had rarely encountered. even among his professional colleagues. As the ballade moved into its middle section, Victoria's playing became even more expressive. She took the melody through a series of variations, each one more emotionally charged than the last. Her touch on the keys was perfect, sometimes soft as silk, sometimes powerful enough to make the entire concert hall resonate with sound. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every note. Even the music critics who had come expecting to write amusing reviews about a deluded amateur were leaning forward in their seats, trying to process what they were hearing. Victoria's technique was flawless, but that wasn't what made her playing so captivating. It was the emotion she brought to the music, the way she made every phrase mean something. She played like someone who had lived through real loss and real pain, who understood that music wasn't just about playing the right notes at the right time. It was about taking everything you had experienced in life and transforming it into something beautiful. The ballad reached its dramatic climax, and Victoria's playing became thunderous. Her hands flew across the keyboard with incredible speed and precision, but every note was perfectly controlled. The music filled the concert hall with such power that some people in the audience felt their hearts racing along with the rhythm. But then, just as suddenly as the storm had begun, Victoria brought the music back down to a whisper. The final section of the ballade was like a prayer, gentle and hopeful despite all the darkness that had come before. Her touch became incredibly delicate, and the piano responded with sounds so beautiful they seemed to hang in the air like perfume. As Victoria played the final measures, she thought about her journey, from a promising young musician to a woman cleaning floors, and now somehow back to the piano where she belonged. The music had never really left her. It had just been waiting patiently for her to remember who she was. The last note of the ballade faded away, and for several seconds, the concert hall remained in complete silence. Victoria sat at the piano with her hands still on the keys, hardly able to believe what had just happened. She had played better than she had ever played in her life, even as a young woman with dreams of a professional career. Then, slowly, the audience began to respond. It started with one person clapping, then another. Then suddenly the entire concert hall erupted in applause. People were standing up, many of them with tears in their eyes. The ovation went on, and Victoria sat at the piano in shock, overwhelmed by the response. She could see faces in the audience that had gone from skeptical to amazed to deeply moved. The music critics were applauding enthusiastically. The conservatory director was shaking his head in disbelief. Even some of the younger musicians who had come expecting to be entertained by her failure were clapping with genuine respect. Victoria finally stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. The applause continued, and she saw something in their faces that she hadn't seen in 20 years. Recognition. Not just of her technical skill, but of her artistry, her ability to take music and make it mean something profound. But as the applause finally began to die down, Victoria remembered that this wasn't over. She had proven that she could play, but Sebastian still had his turn. She looked across the stage to where he was standing, and the expression on his face was unlike anything she had ever seen. The confident, arrogant man who had challenged her the night before was gone. In his place stood someone who looked shaken, uncertain, and perhaps for the first time in his life a little afraid. Sebastian had built his entire identity around being the best, the most talented, the most deserving of success. But what he had just witnessed challenged everything he believed about himself and his place in the music world. The audience was settling back into their seats, but the energy in the room had completely changed. They were no longer here to watch a spectacle or to see someone put in their place. They were here to witness something extraordinary, and they all knew that what came next would determine whether this night would be remembered as a fluke or as the moment when everything changed. Victoria walked to the side of the stage and nodded to Sebastian. It was his turn now, and everyone in the concert hall was waiting to see how he would respond to what they had just experienced. Sebastian stood frozen at the side of the stage, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Victoria was supposed to be a deluded amateur who would embarrass herself and prove his point about the natural order of the music world. Instead, she had just delivered one of the most moving performances he had ever heard. The audience was settling back into their seats, but the atmosphere in the concert hall had completely transformed. Where there had been anticipation for a spectacle, now there was genuine excitement for what would come next. Sebastian could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to Victoria's extraordinary performance. For the first time in his professional career, Sebastian felt truly nervous. He had performed for presidents, royalty, and the most demanding audiences in the world, always with complete confidence in his abilities. But standing on this stage, following Victoria's performance, he felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. He walked slowly toward the piano, his mind racing as he tried to decide what to play. He had originally planned to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. It was a piece that would showcase his superior training and technique, demonstrating why years of conservatory education mattered. But now, after hearing Victoria play with such raw emotion and authenticity, Sebastian wondered if technical difficulty would be enough. The audience had just experienced something that went far beyond mere technique. They had witnessed music that came from the soul, and Sebastian suddenly realized that his usual approach might fall flat. As he sat down at the piano bench, Sebastian could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air in the concert hall. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and tried to summon the confidence that had carried him through countless performances. He began the opening of the Rachmaninoff Concerto, his fingers moving with the precision and speed that had made him famous. The technical execution was flawless. Every note was perfectly placed. Every phrase was exactly as he had practiced it thousands of times. From a purely mechanical standpoint, his performance was everything that conservatory training was meant to produce. But something was missing, and everyone in the audience could feel it. Where Victoria's playing had been alive with emotion and personal meaning, Sebastian's performance felt cold and calculated. He was playing the notes correctly, but he wasn't saying anything with them. The music was technically perfect, but emotionally empty. Sebastian realized this too, and it only made him more nervous. He pushed harder, playing with more volume and speed, trying to compensate for the lack of emotional connection with sheer technical display. But the harder he tried, the more mechanical his playing became. In the audience, people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. After the transcendent experience of Victoria's performance, Sebastian's playing felt hollow by comparison. The music critics who had come expecting to write about the difference between professional and amateur musicians were now witnessing something they hadn't anticipated: a professionally trained musician being outclassed by someone who played from the heart. Sebastian could sense the audience's response, and panic began to set in. He had never been in a situation where his technical skills weren't enough to win over an audience. All his life he had been told that proper training and breeding were what mattered in music. He had built his entire identity around being superior to others because of his background and education. But Victoria had just proven that those things meant nothing if you didn't have something real to say through your music. She had played with a depth of feeling that Sebastian had never learned to access. In all his years of conservatory training, no one had taught him how to be vulnerable, how to let his own experiences and emotions flow through the music. As he continued playing, Sebastian found himself thinking about his life. He had grown up wealthy and privileged, with every advantage money could buy. He had never struggled, never faced real hardship, never experienced the kind of loss and sacrifice that had shaped Victoria's character. His music reflected that. It was polished and perfect, but it had no depth because he had no depth. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, his fingers faltered on the keys. He recovered quickly, but several people in the audience noticed the mistake. Sebastian never made mistakes. He was known for his technical perfection, and the fact that he was struggling now only highlighted how rattled he had become. He pushed through the rest of the concerto, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Every phrase reminded him of what was missing from his playing and from his life. He had spent so many years looking down on others, believing that his training and background made him inherently superior, that he had forgotten music was supposed to be about more than just playing the right notes. When Sebastian finally reached the end of the piece, the applause was polite but restrained. It was the kind of response he might have received for a competent but unremarkable performance at a local recital. not the enthusiastic ovation he was used to receiving. The contrast with the reaction to Victoria's performance was stark and painful. Sebastian stood up from the piano bench, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. He had just experienced his first real failure as a performer, and it was happening in front of an audience that included some of the most important people in the classical music world. He looked out at the faces in the audience and saw something he had never seen before when he performed: disappointment. These people had expected greatness from him, had come believing in his reputation, and he had let them down. Worse, he had been outperformed by someone he had dismissed as unworthy of sharing the same stage. Victoria was still standing at the side of the stage, watching him with an expression that wasn't triumphant or mocking. Instead, she looked almost sad, as if she understood what he was going through. That somehow made Sebastian feel even worse. He had challenged her, expecting to humiliate her, but she had beaten him with such grace that she could afford to feel sorry for him. The audience began to murmur among themselves, and Sebastian caught fragments of their conversations. "I can't believe what we just heard. The difference was like night and day. Who is this woman? How did we not know about her?" Sebastian seemed completely off his game. "That was the most moving performance I've heard in years." Each comment felt like another blow to Sebastian's ego. He had spent his entire career being the center of attention, the star that everyone came to see. Now he was being ignored while people talked about the janitor who had just shown him what real musicianship looked like. But as the initial shock and embarrassment began to fade, Sebastian found himself feeling something unexpected. Alongside the humiliation, there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who was genuinely better than him. Not because of training or background or connections, but because of something deeper and more authentic. It was a crushing blow to his ego, but it was also liberating. All his life he had carried the pressure of being the best, of living up to everyone's expectations, of maintaining his image as the perfect classical musician. Tonight that pressure had been lifted. He had failed publicly, and somehow that failure was teaching him something that all his years of success had not. Sebastian walked slowly toward Victoria, the audience watching his every move. When he reached her, he stopped and looked into her eyes. What he saw there wasn't the gloating he expected, but understanding and compassion. She knew what it felt like to lose everything, to have dreams crushed, to start over from nothing, and somehow that gave her the grace to be kind to someone who had tried to humiliate her. Sebastian stood in front of Victoria, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. The entire concert hall watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone expected anger, excuses, or maybe even a dramatic exit. Instead, Sebastian did something that shocked everyone in the audience, including himself. He extended his hand to Victoria, and when she hesitantly took it, he bowed deeply. Not the shallow, performative bow of a celebrity acknowledging applause, but a genuine gesture of respect and humility. "I owe you an apology," Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent concert hall. "Not just for tonight, but for everything I said yesterday. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about what music really means." Victoria looked at him with surprise. This wasn't the arrogant man who had challenged her less than 24 hours ago. Something fundamental had changed in Sebastian during those painful minutes at the piano. "You don't need to apologize," Victoria said quietly. "We all have different journeys with music." But Sebastian shook his head. "No, I do need to apologize. And not just to you." He turned to face the audience, many of whom were leaning forward in their seats, fascinated by this unexpected turn of events. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian began, his voice steadier now, "I invited you here tonight to witness what I thought would be a lesson about the importance of proper training and breeding in classical music. I believed that talent without the right background was meaningless, that music was the exclusive domain of those with the proper credentials." He paused, looking back at Victoria, then continued. "Instead, you've all witnessed a masterclass in what music is really about. It's not about where you studied or who your teachers were. It's about having something genuine to say and the courage to say it." The audience listened in stunned silence. Public apologies from classical musicians of Sebastian's stature were almost unheard of. The music world was built on maintaining image and reputation, not admitting failure or fault. "Victoria," Sebastian said, turning back to her, "your performance tonight was one of the most moving pieces of music I've ever heard." You didn't just play Chopin's ballad. You told your story through it. Every note meant something because it came from real experience, real emotion, real life. Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. For 20 years, she had convinced herself that she had given up music forever, that her dreams were just childish fantasies she needed to let go of. But tonight had proven that music had never really left her. It had just been waiting for the right moment to emerge again. Dr. Patterson, the director of the conservatory, stood up from his seat in the third row. He was an elderly man with white hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. Everyone knew his reputation. He was one of the most respected figures in classical music education. "Excuse me," Dr. Patterson said, his voice cutting through the murmur that had started in the audience. "Miss Victoria, I wonder if I might have a word with you." Victoria looked nervous as the distinguished older man approached the stage. She had seen him around the concert hall before, but had never imagined he would know she existed, much less want to speak with her. "I've been running the conservatory for 37 years, Dr. Patterson said as he climbed the steps to the stage. "In that time, I've heard thousands of students and hundreds of professional musicians. But what you did tonight," he shook his head in amazement. "That was extraordinary," the audience murmured in agreement. Coming from Dr. Patterson, this was high praise indeed. "I have to ask," the director continued, "where did you study? Who were your teachers? Because whoever trained you deserves recognition for developing such remarkable artistry." Victoria felt overwhelmed by the attention. "I studied at the regional conservatory when I was young," she said, "but that was a long time ago. I haven't had formal training in 20 years. Dr. Patterson's eyebrows rose. 20 years? And you've been working as a janitor all this time?" Victoria nodded, feeling embarrassed by the contrast between her background and everyone else in the room. "Would you mind telling us what happened? How does someone with your level of talent end up—" He gestured around the concert hall. "Working here instead of performing here?" Victoria took a deep breath. She had kept her story private for so long, but something about this moment made her want to share it. "My mother got sick when I was 22, she began. "Cancer. I was just starting my professional career, had a few small performance contracts lined up. But she needed care and we couldn't afford professional help. So I took whatever jobs I could find that would let me take care of her." The audience listened intently, many of them realizing they were hearing something deeply personal and important. "She lived for 8 more years, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, "and I was grateful for every day I had with her. But by the time she passed, I'd been away from music for so long that I thought it was too late to go back. Who would hire a pianist in her 30s with no recent experience? So I just stayed away. I told myself I had made peace with it." Dr. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "And yet clearly you never stopped being a musician. Music like what we heard tonight doesn't come from nowhere." "I think," Victoria said slowly, "that music never really leaves you if it's truly part of who you are. It just waits." Sebastian, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Victoria, I want to make you an offer. I have connections throughout the music world. Recording labels, concert venues, festival directors. I'd like to help you get back into professional music if that's something you want." Victoria looked at him with surprise. "Why would you do that? Especially after tonight?" Sebastian smiled, and for the first time since Victoria had met him, it was a genuine, humble expression. "Because tonight you taught me something I should have learned years ago. Music isn't a competition. It's not about proving you're better than someone else. It's about sharing something beautiful with the world. And you have something beautiful to share." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Actually, Sebastian, I'd like to make an offer as well." He turned to Victoria. "Our conservatory has a program for adult students, people who want to return to music after life has taken them in other directions. We also have a position opening for an artist in residence, someone who can mentor students not just in technique, but in what it means to find your authentic voice in music." Victoria felt dizzy. 24 hours ago, she had been invisible, just another face in a uniform that nobody noticed. Now she was standing on stage being offered opportunities she had thought were lost forever. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," called out someone from the audience, and suddenly other voices joined in, encouraging her to accept the offers. Victoria looked out at the faces in the audience. The same people who had come expecting to watch her fail were now cheering for her success. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her talent even when Victoria had stopped believing in herself. "Yes," Victoria said, and the words seemed to hang in the air like a perfect note. Yes to all of it. The applause that followed was thunderous, longer and more enthusiastic than anything the concert hall had heard in years. People were standing, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. As the ovation continued, Sebastian leaned over to Victoria. "You know, I think this is the beginning of something wonderful. For both of us." Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in 20 years. The janitor who had cleaned these floors every morning was gone. In her place stood a musician who had finally come home.